There are different ways of learning about frogs. One way, familiar to those of us of a certain age who studied high school biology, is to dissect the frog. Just saying those words calls up memories of scalpels and pins and dissecting pans, the pungent smell of formaldehyde, and the act of carefully opening up a deceased frog, examining the different organs with a probe, seeing how they all connect. It's a way of learning. What are the constituent parts of a frog? Of its digestive system, of its cardiovascular system? What do they do? Why are they there? You can learn a lot about frogs that way. Another way to study frogs, however, doesn't involve carefully picking them apart at all. Rather, you can learn about frogs simply by observing them, alive and in their natural environment. How do they move? How do they act? What do they eat? Do they hop? Do they swim? What is their place within their surrounding ecosystem? It's a style of learning that is essentially just sitting with the frog and seeing what it might tell us. And it isn't that one way of frog learning is right and the other is wrong, more that the two ways of learning ask different questions and reveal different aspects of frogness, if that's a word. And I share that illustration as a way of helping us to understand that there are different ways of reading Scripture also. Different methods that can teach us different things. Our Scripture lesson for this morning is an example. The visit of the Magi to the young child Jesus, which is described only in Matthew's Gospel. One way of reading the passage is to pick it apart and examine it intently, much like dissecting a frog. And if we do that, we might observe that Matthew tells the story in such a way that it correlates very closely to certain texts and events in the Hebrew Scriptures. More than any other gospel, Matthew is attentive to these linkages. For example, Isaiah chapter 60 speaks of the restoration of Jerusalem's hopes after a time of exile and desolation. And the prophet writes, "A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall proclaim the praise of the Lord." So when Matthew speaks of astrologers or magi arriving from afar with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh, his hearers would have immediately recognized this Isaiah passage. Likewise, Herod's decree to kill all the children in Bethlehem 2 years old and under recalls the Pharaoh's order in Exodus chapter 1 to kill all the male Hebrew children in Egypt. Matthew, scholars say, wants his readers to correlate the birth of Jesus with the birth of Moses. And the flight of the Holy Family into Egypt, again described only in Matthew, allows Matthew to quote Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. "Out of Egypt I have called my son." So Matthew artfully weaves Hebrew Scriptures into the infancy narrative of Jesus so that God's past redemptive works in Israel's history will become present in the coming of her Messiah. Now, such dissecting naturally leads us to questions like, is there anywhere in the historical record, apart from Matthew's Gospel, that documents Herod's slaughter of the innocents? Or perhaps, the wise men were astrologers who sought signs in the heavens. Is there anything in our modern study of astronomy that offers clues about the wondrous star that they observed and followed? Also, do stars move? Did these events actually occur historically as Matthew describes them? Or is Matthew's account literary and intended to give a compelling backstory to the birth of Jesus? Well, you get the idea. One way of studying the story in our Scripture lesson is to pick it apart and question it and examine how one Scripture connects to another Scripture, connects to another, and connects to history. And this is known as the historical critical method of studying Scripture. And like dissecting a frog, there's a ton to be learned in practicing this method. But another way of looking at Scripture is simply to observe it for what it is and for what it says. To sit with it. Here's the story. So let's take it in or place ourselves in the midst of it. What does the story bring to life? And this is the method that's more interesting to me for today and for this sermon. Rather than picking the story apart, we simply take it in. And so on this first Sunday after Epiphany, we hear once more the familiar story of the wise men and their visit to the infant Jesus. And the first thing that we can observe is that the Magi, in all their wisdom, get a whole lot right. They carefully observe the heavenly portents, they discern the birth of the King of the Jews, or the Messiah, and they journey a great distance to pay him homage or to bow their knee before him, to honor him and to profess loyalty to him. So they get the event right, but they get the location and perhaps the meaning of the entire event altogether wrong. Discerning that a king has been born to the Jews, they proceed immediately to Jerusalem, which would make perfect sense according to everything that they think they know, everything their experience may have taught them about kings and messiahs. Jerusalem has been for 1,000 years or more the place of Israel's and Judah's political power. It's where King David established his seat of royal power, and it's where David's son Solomon built the magnificent Jerusalem temple. Jerusalem is a city of walls and of wealth. Jerusalem is the center of the regional economy. People flow to Jerusalem to worship and to trade. And in order for someone to be born king of the Jews, well, it only makes sense, based on everything the Magi know, that he would be born at this nexus of political power, military power, economic power, and if we would so name the temple establishment and the nerve center of Jewish faith observances, religious power. Because any sort of Messiah that the Magi can imagine would come to wield political power, military power, economic power, and religious power. So the wise men journey to Jerusalem because they can imagine no place else, and they begin to ask, where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we have observed his star at its rising, and we have come to pay him homage. Well, in their poking about in the corridors of power, in their inquiries in Jerusalem, the marketplaces and the temple, they stir up a lot. Perhaps the imagination of the people, and certainly the anxieties of King Herod. You see, if there is anything that an earthly king fears or guards against, it's another king, a rival or a successor. Because when you have great power, when you have great wealth, when you have great authority, that's when the knives come out. Someone eventually is coming for you to replace you. So Herod, upon hearing of this potential rival, however young, is frightened. Even the idea of a Messiah is enough to stir unrest and to disturb the peace. So Herod sends for the wise men and inquires of them, tries to put everything that they know together with everything that his advisors and his courtiers and his contacts in the religious establishment know in order to identify where this purported Messiah might reside. The wise men want to pay homage to him, and Herod wants to put paid to him, that is, to eradicate him. So the wise men, for all that they have gotten right, have gotten this whole Messiah thing disastrously wrong. The Messiah isn't to be found at the headwaters of Jerusalem's power at all, but in the backwater of Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem isn't far from Jerusalem, not geographically. Geographically, it's only about 9 miles away. But politically, economically, In terms of its stature or its significance, it is a world apart. Even in the prophecy that is quoted from Micah in Matthew's Gospel, Bethlehem's seeming insignificance is hinted at. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. To say that something is by no means true is to imply that such is exactly what people would say. Bethlehem is an afterthought of a place. And that is where the Messiah is to be found. Not in Jerusalem, not among the movers and shakers and power brokers, but among the least, among the poor, among the disaffected, outside the corridors of power altogether. If you want to find him, that's where you must look. And picture the scene when they do find him. The wise men who have come expecting a king with gifts befitting a king, gold and frankincense and myrrh, instead ultimately find themselves awkwardly kneeling in a humble Bethlehem house. I believe the actual address was 222 Nobody Lane. And recognizing that all the lavish gifts that they brought to the child are nothing that he wants or needs. The comedian Kathy Ladman has a delightful piece describing the scene. The wise men, she says, come to the child and offered him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And then she pauses and deadpans, myrrh, to a baby shower. And then she continues, I guess Mary was very polite about it. Oh, myrrh. How lovely. One can never have enough myrrh. And we can laugh at Ladman's imagined scene, but like all comedy, it reveals a hidden truth. With hindsight, the gift seems silly in a way, not practical at all. Out of place and awkward in such a humble setting. What would have seemed perfectly fitting in a palace seems to be of little use to the Messiah that they have found. And it makes me wonder about what they talked about on their way home, these magi. Because having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they slipped out of town on the back streets and left for their own country by another road. They went home differently. Quite differently. And on the way, they likely said to one another, well, that really wasn't what we expected at all. Now, all of that brings the story of the Magi's visit to life for me in a whole new way. But we haven't really learned anything of use from the text unless we somehow apply it to ourselves. And the thing that I take away from the story, at least for today, is this. If the story somehow reveals that Jesus is not about strength and not about power and not about wealth and not even about organized religion as represented by the temple, if those who would seek him need to somehow look outside the world's palaces and fortresses and commercial centers and even religious centers, if the most acceptable offering we might bring him is not our gold and frankincense and myrrh, our love and our compassion and our obedience, then why do we continue to place so much trust in wealth and power and strength and force? And why do we not trust that kindness and generosity and hospitality and mercy are in fact the tools we must employ in the world if his kingdom is ever to come? In fact, Matthew's story reveals the devastating effect of misplacing our trust. The Magi's innocent assumption is that the Messiah would be found at the nexus of all the world's powers. And instead, that is where they encounter Herod. And they're seeking the Messiah amid the means and the methods in which the world places its trust indirectly contributes to Herod's unthinkable act of violence and vengeance. Epiphany, which literally means God being made known, is the realization that Jesus and all that he stands for is the opposite of Herod and all that he stands for. God is made known in the strangest and the simplest and the poorest of places. And if we encounter the child, we must, if we are wise, leave the encounter by quite a different way than how we came. Quite a different way indeed. Amen.